we decided that I would do a bit, and then Loren would read, and then I would do a bit, and then he's coming back. Your attention can shift that way. Loren, where are you?
I'm here.
Oh, such power. Thank you so much. This is great company to be in. Hearing the two poems that Loren wrote, one about and one to his father, reminded me of how many times I have said in the last 15 or 20 years that my own relationship with my father was both the most difficult and in many ways the most rewarding of my life. I was 45 years old on the day I drove to the family farm to say something to my parents that had been long in coming. One of the things I learned over the succeeding years is that telling someone a difficult truth isn't as simple as saying it and then everybody moves on. My father never quite came to terms with the choices I made about myself after I decided that I could live with myself as a gay man. I'm going to read a section from a piece also out of the memoir. This is, the chapter is called Crossing the Nueces. The Nueces River is a bit north of where I grew up, and I always felt of it as a dividing line on my way to Austin and then on my way back. In the late summer of 2013, I called Daddy to let him know that Scott and I would get married that October in Taos, New Mexico. I had no intention of inviting my father to the wedding and no expectation that he would express so much as a neutral opinion. Scott suggested I save myself the bother and let Daddy know about our wedding after the fact, or let him find out by way of the family grapevine. My sons said much the same. Why let their grandfather break the continuous chorus of congratulations that rained on us from everyone who heard about our upcoming wedding? But I'd spent too many years not telling my father what he didn't want to hear, and feeling with each little act of cowardice that I was making short work of shame, letting it germinate from within. On the afternoon we spoke, Daddy was several weeks short of his 89th birthday. Age had gentled him, had made him frail. But my news got his dander up. It put a bit of the old truculence back in his voice. He pronounced our wedding plans foolish, and then tumbled into a rant that sounded like an aged Rush Limbaugh free associating. I almost laughed when he happened upon abortion. Not that the subject itself is funny, but that, gay wedding or not, Scott and I were not likely ever to consider terminating a pregnancy. My part in the conversation was to say, Daddy, I am not going to argue abortion with you. After which he asked me a string of those ludicrous yes-no questions to which any sane answer is something else entirely. Each time I responded that I hadn't called to argue. Eventually, he ran out of steam and the conversation was over. That call was to be the last act in the process of my coming out to my parents. By year's end, Daddy's health had begun to fail. In March of 2014, after months of back pain, doctors identified a malignant tumor on his lower spine. Surgery was out of the question, but radiation treatment shrank the tumor and left him without pain. He spent about 3 months at home on the farm with our stepmother, and when that proved untenable, moved himself into a nursing center in George West, some 24 miles north. I drove down while Daddy was having radiation treatments, drove down to help out when he went in to have his pacemaker battery replaced, drove down simply to spend time with him on the farm and at the nursing center. The point now was to breathe the same air as my father, to be there with him, to let him know that I loved him, to do for him the little things he could no longer do, as he had done for me during my infancy and childhood, as he would have done for any of his adult children had we needed him. Need is the important word here. During the year of his failing health, I didn't need my father's stamp of approval, didn't need a deathbed change of heart. Need was on his side now. Daddy needed my sister and brothers. He needed me. Our needs were simpler and easily satisfied. We needed his company, needed whatever time was left of his presence in our lives. Nothing more. After the pacemaker procedure, I drove Daddy and my stepmother back to the farm, a distance just short of 50 miles. Leaving the hospital as I turned onto Ocean Drive, the hatchback door lifted open. I hadn't shut it properly. My father decreed that I would stop right there and shut it. Not advisable in traffic on Ocean Drive. By the time I turned into a side street, pulled over and stopped, Elwood Meischen was out of patience, as only Elwood Meischen could be. Minutes later, his voice filled with disgust when it became apparent I didn't know Corpus Christi's freeway system like the back of my hand. In the midst of his running commentary on this shortcoming, he several times pronounced that I was driving too fast, that only one of my siblings rode at a sane speed. It doesn't matter which. His aim was to show me that I'd been measured and found wanting. We'd only gone 15 miles when it was time to stop for burgers. I didn't do that right either. 15 miles and he'd reminded me of every single thing about him that had pissed me off during the 6+ decades I had known him. He was my father. I loved him anyway. In February of 2015, Scott and I drove to Albuquerque and picked out our new house. When we returned to Austin, my father had been through a medical ordeal that sounded like something out of Kafka. With 2 60-mile ambulance rides, a nursing staff on one end that seemed to have their hands tied, a urologist on the other who didn't want to bother seeing a patient in the emergency room, a urinary tract infection that was entirely avoidable. On March 3rd, Judy called to say she thought our father was near the end. I drove down that afternoon. Daddy knew me when I entered the room. I was certain at least that he knew my voice. But he seemed to exist in 2 places at once. In the room with us, my brothers were there when I arrived, and wherever his visions were taking him. Even when he said nothing, it was clear another sphere overlapped the one we could see. Daddy's eyes moved about the room. Not a random search pattern fueled by fidgets, but the movement of eyes focusing in turn on a series of visitors visible only to him. We decided not to leave him alone at night. My youngest brother stayed with him Tuesday night. I drove to Corpus Christi and spent the night with my sister and brother-in-law. Wednesday morning, I drove back to George West. I spent the day with Daddy and then took up night vigil in the room with him. I fell asleep and woke, fell asleep and woke again, each time roused by a frightened cry from my father's bed. He was beyond coherence, mostly even beyond words, but each time he cried out, I took his hand and told him I was there, assured him he was safe, assured him he was loved. Each time he quieted. It was my voice, I'm sure, that soothed him. A familiar voice, even if he no longer had a name for it. But I did. David, Elwood's son. Thursday morning, my sister arrived, and by early afternoon, I was on my way back to Austin. Saturday morning, before I could make plans to drive down again, my brothers called to say that Daddy was gone. They had been in the room with him. They had been talking to each other while he slept. Our father breathed his last so quietly, Laryl and Vance didn't notice until they heard how quiet the room had become. I wrote and delivered Daddy's eulogy. My sons were there, my daughter-in-law, my siblings and their families, aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and neighbors by the dozen. But not Scott. He'd been a stranger to my father, and my father to him. Because Daddy hadn't wanted to know him, Scott felt like a stranger in the family that had shaped me. He couldn't imagine attending a stranger's funeral among strangers. So be it. I returned from the funeral, said goodbye to my sons and daughter-in-law, plunged into the final stages of packing. On March 23rd, I spent 14 hours on the road with our somewhat freaked out cat. Here in Albuquerque, I supervised roof repairs, new flooring, a 12-foot by 12-foot built-in bookcase with library ladder. Scott stayed behind and closed up the house in Austin. On April 9th, he flew home to me. Here, on the northwestern edge of Albuquerque, canyons carved of volcanic rock, tumbleweed windstorms, desert landscape, desert air, desert sky. Here, my father's death seems as insubstantial as a shimmer of sun on the distant horizon. Here, I walk for miles with Scott, a new life unfolding before us. Here, the Rio Grande separates not one country from another, but two parts of our city. Here, folks pronounce the E in Grande. Here, the Nueces River recedes to a memory of a line that no longer divides. On the other side, a world no longer mine. The tie was my father. I claim him, if not the ties that bound him to the lie that once bound me. Thank you. My friend Loren is right. Sometimes the emotion gets into a person reading. Loren is going to read some more, and I can't wait to hear it. What I wanted to say before I sit down is that he and I have agreed that afterwards we're headed over to Mandela's Italian, which is just up Guadalupe Street here in Austin. I would love to see any of you there. I'm sure Loren would. I have already spoken to several former students. I can't tell you how good it makes me feel as a teacher, high school teacher of 27 years, that former students and writing friends are here in the audience. So think about joining us, and if you don't know where Mandela's is, Google would tell you, and so would I. And here's Loren.